Okay, I've got my leg clamped in a vise here. This is the outside of the leg. Here's the inside. So my apron is going to go here. My reveal is 1/8 of an inch. So the first thing I want to do is draw that line 1/8 of an inch in. I'm going to draw the outline of the apron, and then I'll draw the tenon inside that. I'm going to set this about 1/8. Verify that. That looks good. And the apron is 3/4 of an inch thick. All right, and it's 1 3/4 wide. So there is my apron outline. So the tenon is going to be 1/4 inch thick. So I'll mark out the 1/4. I'm only going to draw all of this information in one spot, and then I'll transfer the information I need to make the mortises to the rest of the surfaces. Now I want to come in, I don't want to be too close to the edge here because I have a short grade, so I'm going to come in 3/8 of an inch from there and 3/8 from the bottom. So we'll draw the tenon on here, or the mortise. So that's the material that gets removed. When I make the mortises, I'm going to have the leg sitting on this surface, so that'll be flat, and I'll set the slot mortiser so the bit's cutting that that distance from the edge. So once that's set, I won't have to change anything for the rest of these setups. The only information I need at that point is the length of the mortise. So I'm going to transfer that information to the rest of the legs. So I'll set my square for that. Make sure that's okay. That looks good. And then that will just get transferred to everything else. And then the other thing I want to make sure, I'm just going to make sure I got that on the correct side of the part. So I'll rotate all of these so they're all facing the same. Okay, so those are all marked. Now I need to get the other end. So I have all the information I need to cut the mortises now. So this is the slot mortiser I have in my shop. It's most similar to the multi-router. It's got left and right, in and out, and then the height adjustment is down towards the bottom here. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in a 1/4 inch spiral bit. So this just uses a regular router for the motor, same as the multi-router. I've got hold downs here, so I'm going to put my leg on here. I want my reference surface to be the outside of the leg, so I'll put that like that. And I'll clamp this down. Depending on the hold down, you might want to be careful where you put this. For thinner parts, you don't want to be clamping over the mortise and then the part actually crushes a little bit when you're cutting the mortise. This is thick enough where there won't be an issue, so I'm just going to put the clamp about there. I've got the table roughly centered there, so I'm roughly centered in my mortise. Tighten that up. And then the first thing I'm going to do is get the height set correctly. So to set the height, I'm going to turn the bit so the flutes are up and down. And I'll move this close and then get the bit centered in my lines there. So that looks good. I'll lock that in place. And then I'm going to turn the bit the other direction so the flutes are horizontal. And then I'll set the stops. So I like to go just a little bit past my lines there. And then I'll make the tenon the same size as those lines. So I'll come in 3/8 on from either edge. And that'll give me a little bit of wiggle room for positioning the apron when I glue it up. Okay, so that looks good. That looks good. Now with the bit up against the part, I'm going to set the depth stop. So I want my tenons are going to be 1 inch long. So I'm going to make this about 1 1/16, just slightly deeper. I don't want my tenons to bottom before the shoulders bottom. So about 1 1/16 deep. And I think I am all ready to go here. So what I'll do is I'm going to break the surface on each end. I'll plunge in 1/8 to 1/4 and then plunge in here. And then I'm just going to go back and forth and increase my depth of cut about 1/8 of an inch or so each time till I reach the depth stop. To do the other mortise, I'm going to turn the leg around and I'm going to move this all the way to one end so then I can make sure I'm in the right spot. So that looks good. That looks good. Remember, the height's already set. So now we'll just do that again. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Because that's a 1/4 inch bit, it tends to chatter a little bit. So I was taking smaller cuts than I normally would, but I think that's going to work fine. So I'll continue that for the rest of the legs. So that takes care of the mortises in the legs. So the legs are pretty much done. Just they need detailing. Before we go on to the tenons, I wanted to briefly touch on how I would sand or plane these legs to get the taper nice and smooth. So if I was going to sand them, I'd start with 100 grit. Now I'm not going to use sandpaper now because I don't want to get grit on here that will dull my hand plane, but we'll just pretend there's sandpaper on here. So what I would do, 100 grit, I'd probably start with, depending on how smooth they are. This one has a little bit of a ripple from the table saw. I would, basically just sand the way you'd normally sand. The main thing to keep in mind is not to rock this. As it gets a little narrower, it might be a little easier to rock. Of course, it depends on the size of your legs. You may not even taper your legs. Maybe they're 1 3/4, 1 5/8 all the way down. So regardless, keep the pressure over the leg. And try not to rock either side, and sand. You might want to put some lines on here so you can see that you've sanded past the rough surface. I would feel the edge to see, feel the surface to see if it's you still can see some marks from maybe the table saw. One thing I like to do is have a light down low, so that raking light gives you a better sense of what's going on. Nothing really fancy about this. I would use the hard side of the block through about 150 and then switch to 180, switch to the cork side at 180. And I should say I tend not to use a orbital sander for this, a random orbital sander, because it's too easy to rock it. I personally prefer nice, crisp, flat surfaces. If you're going for a little bit more of a rounded look, that will work fine. The other thing I should mention is, remember, we've got two surfaces here. This is the tapered part, and up where the mortises is still square there. And I would just make sure you keep the sanding block over that surface. Don't go too far onto the tapered, because then you'll start to round that transition. And also make sure we really don't want to round this, because then you're going to see a gap where your apron comes in. So sometimes what I'll do there is I'll actually put a little more pressure on the corner of the sanding block. So I kind of think of that as the corners dipping in. I'm not dipping, but pressure-wise, it's kind of doing that. And that tends to keep things flatter. If you're keeping your pressure totally flat, just the nature of this, it does tend to round things a little bit. So just be particularly careful where you're sanding around the mortise. If I was hand planing this, I'm going to use my number 5. It's a little bit longer than, say, a smoothing plane. This is a fairly long piece, so I want a longer surface. Also, this transition from the square portion around the mortise to the taper is very subtle. So I want a little bit longer plane, so I've got more of a reference here when I start planing. So what I like to do in a case like this is put some pencil lines here so I can see where my transition is occurring when I'm planing. As I start to plane, you'll see some of those lines disappear. So pressure at the front, and then as I come down, pressure towards the back. And you can hear it's not very even. There's a couple high spots and low spots. So pressure at the front in the beginning, and then as I come through, pressure transitions towards the back of the plane. So you can see now that I've planed away some of those lines, it's very obvious where I've planed and where I haven't planed. And I can also see, and I can hear that I was missing some spots on that last pass. I think I pretty much cleaned everything up. I'll just take a couple more passes here. And there's my 4-inch line. I'm almost to it, but I'm close enough. Note too, this transition is pretty much square to the edge. That tells me that this surface is parallel. It's not angled this way. If that was at an angle, that would tell me these two aren't aligned this way. They'd be a little bit out of whack. So that looks great. I'll go ahead and do the other side. I always put it in here. Of course, I've got the flat surface down. Snug this up just enough to hold it, and then I want to make sure, do you hear that snap? That tells me that wasn't quite down. So now I'm nice and flat against my reference. Put my lines on here. Okay, so I'm comparing this to over here. Looks pretty good. Maybe another pass on this side. Okay, that looks great. You can see the plane is much quicker than sanding, so that's a nice surface. Plus, you know, you're not going to get any smoother than that by sanding. That's 1200 grit maybe. That's nice and smooth.